things that has proven most alluring and enticing to human beings from generation to generation to generation has been the allure, the attraction, the enticement of idolatry. All the way down through time, down through the centuries, we can read of it in the pages of the Scriptures. God's own people, the nation of Israel, time after time were attracted and enticed to what the nations around them had, and they were attracted into idolatry. Going back to the very beginning, mankind over and over has demonstrated an attraction, an enticement to idolatry. Ultimately, the allure of idolatry is that human beings are drawn to what they can see. Human beings are drawn to what can be seen and touched and felt. Human beings are drawn to what is seen. And throughout even the history of the people of God, there has been this tendency to elevate symbolism over substance, because really the worship of idols is the elevation of symbolism over substance. Here something that is a symbol is put in place of the reality of the substance. So ultimately, idolatry is an elevation of symbolism over substance. I would like for us today to clearly understand what constitutes true and acceptable worship of God. Because this is a fundamental subject, and it is one that has, as we see through the pages of Scripture over and over, there have been fundamental misunderstandings that have gotten entangled many of God's people down through time, down through the centuries. And there are things that we need to clearly understand and to recognize. Because you see, ultimately, God, the true God, is the only real source of security. There is no security, there is no guarantee with anything or anyone other than the true and living God. The true God is the only source of security. Now that may sound very plain and very simple, but if we turn back to an account given in the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel, we will notice that the reality of this fact, that the true God, the true worship of the true God, is the only real source of security, we'll find that this presented a very rude awakening to some people who should have known better. Now, 1 Samuel opens, of course, with the family of Samuel prior to Samuel's birth, having come to the place where God's headquarters was at that time, and that is, of course, to the area of Shiloh. In verse 3 of 1 Samuel 1, they came up yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Eternal of Hosts in Shiloh. Now, Shiloh was a location in northern Israel where the tabernacle was first set after Joshua crossed the Jordan River and led Israel across. In the days of Joshua, the Ark of the Covenant was placed there in Shiloh, the tabernacle was erected, and Shiloh represented the headquarters of the people of God. That was the place to which God's people went in terms of worship at the annual festivals, where the sacrifices were offered, where the priesthood was. Now, by the time we come here to 1 Samuel, the story in 1 Samuel, we are down over 3 centuries from the time, down 3 centuries from the time that Joshua brought the children of Israel into the Promised Land. 3 centuries is a long time. 3 centuries ago would bring us back to 1693. Now, that's been a long time ago. A lot of American history and a lot of world history has transpired in the last 3 centuries. So the Ark of the Covenant had been located in Shiloh and the tabernacle there for 3 centuries. Eli was a direct descendant of Aaron and was the high priest. His sons, Phinehas and Hophni, assisted him there at the tabernacle as well as other priests, but they were the 2 primary assistants One of them, of course, as the older brother, was in line to be high priest. Phinehas was in line to be high priest. So, we read the story, and it becomes apparent, of course, very early on in the story that you remember, of course, how Samuel's parents prayed and sought God, and God did perform a miracle, and Samuel was born as a child, born in answer to his mother's prayer. Samuel then was brought to the tabernacle as a young lad and grew up there with his parents coming every year. Now, as we pick up the story on down in 1 Samuel chapter 2, we find in verse 22 that Eli was very old. He was on up perhaps in his 80s at this time. He was very old, and he heard all that his sons did unto all Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. His sons were absolutely, abjectly corrupt. Here they were engaged in adultery and fornication, right in the very shadow of the tabernacle. Men who had clearly no fear of God before their eyes. Men that were not living by the Word of God. Men who were in very high positions. Right in the very top echelon in terms of here. And he said unto them, Eli said unto them, Why do you do such things? I hear of your evil dealings by all this people. So their conduct was obviously common knowledge among many people. He says, No, my sons, it's no good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people to transgress. If one man sin against another, the judge shall judge him. But if a man sin against the Eternal, who shall entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto the voice of their father, because the Lord would slay them. God had plans for them based on their attitude and on their conduct. But here they were setting this sort of an example, and it had influenced the people. Now, as we come on down through the story, we find that in verse 21 of chapter 3, that the Eternal appeared again in Shiloh, for the Eternal revealed himself by Samuel in Shiloh, by the word of the Eternal. So as Samuel grew up as a teenage boy, God began to work through him, and this was the case. Now, we find that there was a war that ensued. The Philistines, Israel assembled to go out against the Philistines to battle. We read this in chapter 4. And we find in verse 2 that the Philistines put themselves in array against Israel. And when they joined battle, Israel was smitten before the Philistines, and they slew of the army in the field about 4,000 men. And when the people were coming to the camp, the elders of Israel said, Why has the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? Let us fetch the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of Shiloh unto us, and when it comes among us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. Now you notice the thinking here. The people have been assembled to go out to fight the Philistines. They went out to fight the Philistines, and they were severely defeated in a battle that saw 4,000 Israelites slaughtered. Well, they began to scratch their heads and say, Why have we gotten these kind of results? Why would God allow this sort of thing? Why, we're His people. We know what we'll do. The Ark of the Covenant over here in Shiloh, we're going to bring it out. And of course, God couldn't let anything happen to the Ark, could He? Because the Ark, why, that was built by Moses. And the ark, that contains the 2 tables of stone that God wrote on with His own finger. Aaron's rod that budded, the pot of manna. God couldn't allow anything to happen to the ark. Why, the ark is holy. It represents the very presence of God. God certainly would not allow anything to happen to the ark. We'll bring the ark out, and then we'll win. So they sent to Shiloh, that they might bring from thence the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, which dwells between the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant. And when the ark of the covenant came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth rang again. It echoed and re-echoed. They knew that they were going to win. They knew that victory was within their grasp, because now the ark of the covenant was here. So when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, "What means the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews?" And then they understood that the ark of the eternal was come into the camp. Word got around as to what had happened, and the Philistines were afraid. You see, the stories of what God had done in Egypt were still making the rounds. They said, "God is coming to the camp." And they said, "Woe unto us, for there's not been such a thing heretofore." This is new. "Woe unto us! Who can deliver us out of the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods that smote the Egyptian with the plagues in the wilderness." Then they sort of rallied themselves and said, "Be strong and quit yourselves like men, O Philistines. At least we'll go down fighting." Well, the Philistines fought, verse 10, "and Israel was smitten. And they fled every man to his tent, and there was a great slaughter, and 30,000 Israelites lay dead. And the ark of God was taken captive by the pagan, uncircumcised Philistines. The ark of God was taken captive, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain." Well, somebody had run and come to Shiloh the same day, and when he came running in there, his clothes were torn, and Eli was sitting on a seat by the wayside watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. He had not really wanted that to happen, and yet Eli was evidently inherently a weak leader. He was a man that did not that buckled under pressure, and did not really he had allowed his sons to run wild, and had not really restrained them, even though he had talked to them a few times. He had never really done anything about it. He had allowed them to take the ark against his better judgment, but he was very nervous. This really concerned him. He was filled with anxiety, and when he heard all the commotion, he asked down in verse 14 what's going on, and they came and told him. And he was 98 years old, and his eyes were dimmed, he couldn't see, and when they came and told him who they were, and they said that Israel has fled before the Philistines, there's a great slaughter, your sons are dead, and the ark of God is taken. And when mention was made of the ark of God, Eli fell off the seat backward by the side of the gate, and his neck broke, and he died. He was an old man and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. So here, a very tragic end. Well, you read the story here. Phinehas' wife was in labor. She bore a son. And verse 22, she named him Ichabod, which means the glory is departed from Israel. Because the glory is departed because the ark of God was taken. Now, the Israelites had put their trust in what they could see. They put their trust and their confidence in the ark. Now, wasn't it the ark of God? Hadn't it been made holy by the presence of God? Wasn't it built by Moses? Didn't it contain the very tables of stone written on by the finger of God? Surely God would protect the ark. He wouldn't let anything happen to the ark, would he? Well, people thought that was the answer. You see, they thought that the ark would protect them. They were dead and the ark was captured. Now, the Philistines got the ark. It's sort of like getting a tiger by the tail. The hard part's turning him loose. And the Philistines found out that about the ark. They had the ark, but they found out that what you did with it after you had it was more of a problem. They took it and they brought it to Ashdod. And so they brought it into the house of Dagon. So they had captured, you see, they thought they had captured the God of Israel, and they were going to bring it into their temple there of Dagon. And when they got up early the next morning, they came in, and Dagon was fallen on his face on the earth before the ark of the Lord. Now, That was a little bit embarrassing for them, so they took Dagon and set him back up. They had to take their god, sort of dust him off, set him back up so they could pray to him again, which gives you a little bit of an idea of the futility of idolatry. Well, when they got up the next morning again, Dagon was fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. And that's where, of course, the old superstition comes about stepping on the threshold. The stump of Dagon was all that was left to it. Well, to this day, it says neither the priests of Dagon nor any that come into Dagon's house tread on the threshold. This superstition originated at that time, that somehow the threshold was bad luck. Well, people put 2 and 2 together and they come up with 7 or 5 or 11 and a half, but they don't seem to come up with the right answer so many times. Well, the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them of Ashdod, and he destroyed them, and he smote them with hemorrhoids, the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, and they said, the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, shall not abide with us. So they sent, therefore, and gathered all the lords of the Philistines and said, what are we going to do? And they said, well, I know what. We were selfish. We were keeping this trophy. We won't do that. We're going to send it down to our neighbor in Gath. We want to share the wealth. And we're sort of being selfish here, keeping this ark. We're going to send it down to Gath. So they carried the ark there. And when they carried the ark there, the hand of the Lord was great against the city of Gath. And he smote the men of the city, small and great, and they had hemorrhoids in their secret parts. And they sent the ark to Ekron. Everybody's passing it on. No, look, it's selfish of us to keep it. You take it. And so the ark came to Ekron, and the Ekronites cried out and said, they have brought the ark of the God of Israel to us to slay us and our people. So they said, this isn't going to work. We keep passing the buck. Everybody that gets it, all of a sudden, all these plagues, and people were in misery. And so they sent and gathered together the lords of the Philistines, and they said, look, we've got to figure out what to do with this thing, because we're having trouble. So they sent away, we're going to send it away and let it go to its own place. There were a number of people who died of some sort of plague, and the ones that didn't die wished they were, because they had these severe hemorrhoids, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. Verse 12. So there was a lot of misery in that place. And the ark of the Lord was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. Now the Philistines couldn't figure out how to get rid of it. They didn't know what to do with it. And everywhere they put it, the problems got worse. So they finally decided that if they were going to send it back, they better not send it empty. They were going to send a trespass offering with it, because they wanted to be healed of these afflictions. Well, they didn't know. Here are these poor ignorant pagans. They didn't understand how to worship the true God, but they were being introduced to the fact that the God of Israel is the real God. And this big, leering, ugly fish god that they worshipped, Dagon, was nothing. So they decided to send a trespass offering in verse 4, and this always strikes me here. They didn't know what to send, so what they decided to make in verse 4 was 5 golden hemorrhoids and 5 golden mice, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines. So this is what they decided. They were going to put in these things, and they made, verse 5, the images of the hemorrhoids and images of the mice that mar the land. And so they put that, they got that together and decided that how were they going to get it back? Well, they didn't know how to show proper respect. So they decided what they would do was they would build a new cart that had never carried anything else, because they didn't want to show disrespect to the ark by just sticking it on an old wagon, that they haul lumber in or garbage in or anything else. So they wanted to show respect, but they didn't really know how, but they were doing the best that they could figure out. So they built them a brand new wagon, and they got them 2 milk cows that had never been yoked to pull anything. And they tied these 2 milk cows to the cart and brought the calves back home. Now, can you imagine trying to tie up 2 milk cows that have never been yoked to anything? You're going to yoke them up full of cart. And then you take their calves back to the barn. Well, then they set this ark up. They set the ark up on the cart. And they laid it up there, and they put the jewels of gold, the trespass offering. They stuck that up there. And then they decided to stand back and see what happened. Well, when they did this, verse 12, the cows took the straight way to the way of Bethshemesh, and went along the highway, lowing as they went, and turned not to the right hand or to the left. Now, you know that was a miracle. Here these cows went, and they went straight. They were just bawling away. You know, their calves were way back at the house, back in the barn, but they didn't go back for the calves. They just went straight on down the direction that they were supposed to go. They made a beeline, not wandering around, not deviating to the right hand or to the left. And the lords of the Philistines went along after them. They sort of followed along to see what was happening. And so it tells the story. It came there to Bethshemesh, and the people decided that they would build an altar, and yet that they, in the long run, showed great disrespect to the ark. They were curious. They were going to look in and see what was inside, and they showed less respect to the ark than the Philistines, and there was no excuse for the Israelites in the sense that they definitely should have known better. So there were 53,000. There were over 50,000 men that were smitten of a plague and died there in Bethshemesh because of the disrespect they showed to the ark. So they decided that they wanted to send the ark somewhere else. So it was eventually brought down and put in a came here to a threshing floor. And you read it abode here in Kirjath Jearim about 20 years. And all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. This is verse 2 of chapter 7. And then Samuel spoke unto them, and he said, If you return unto the eternal with all your hearts, then put away the strange gods, and serve the true God only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. The children of Israel put away the Balaam and the Ashtaroth, and they served the Lord. Samuel gathered them together in Mizpah, and in verse, they offered a sacrifice, and then they came against the Philistines in verse 11, smote the Philistines, and verse 13, the Philistines were subdued, and they came no more to the coast of Israel. Now, what is the story? What do we see here? The tendency of Israel, just like all of the other peoples, was to put their trust and confidence in what they could see. Somehow it seemed to them that they could live any way they wanted to, do anything they wanted to do, be just like everybody else, but as long as they clung to the ark, they were okay. Because wasn't the ark holy? Isn't that where God had put His presence? It wasn't necessary for them to do any differently than everybody else did. But as long as they held on to the ark, they were okay. That was a fatal illusion. You see, they thought that their security came from holding on to something. Their security, they thought, derived from a connection with the ark. They never won the battle until they began to establish a relationship with God. Now let's come on forward a little bit over to the book of Jeremiah. Here we come down a period of quite a number of years. In fact, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 500 years. About 500 years have passed since the time of this defeat of the Philistines there under Samuel. Now, 500 years have passed, and here we are now in the last days of the kingdom of Judah. Of course, we know it was their last days. A lot of those people didn't know it was their last days. They knew that the Babylonians had been threatening them, But you see, they felt secure. They knew that the king of Babylon was not really going to do anything to Jerusalem. You know why? Because the ark was there. The temple was there. Solomon's temple, having been built centuries earlier. That was the focal point there in Jerusalem. That was on the great high hill, the great temple. Beautiful building, one of the most beautiful buildings of all ancient times, and it was there. And inside it was the Holy of Holies. And inside that inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, was the Ark of the Covenant. Symbolic of the very presence of God. After all, had not God miraculously filled the temple? You remember the dedicatory prayer of King Solomon? And how God's presence filled the temple so that nobody could even go in there? God had put His presence there. The Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, the temple. So whatever else happened, they knew that they were safe and secure in Jerusalem. That was God's city. God had set His name there. That was going to be all the prophets even testified the fact that God was going to establish His headquarters there, and from Jerusalem all the world would be ruled. Didn't Isaiah, who had lived about 100 years earlier, didn't Isaiah speak of a time when all nations would come up to Jerusalem and the law would go forth from Jerusalem? Why, they'd heard those things. They weren't worried. Chapter 7, verse 1, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Stand in the gate of the Lord's house, and proclaim there this word, and say, Hear the word of the Lord, all you, Judah, that enter in here at these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Eternal of hosts, the God of Israel, Amend your ways and your doings, and I will cause you to dwell in this place. Trust you not in lying words, saying, The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. For if you thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if you thoroughly execute judgment between a man and his neighbor, oppress not the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, shed not innocent blood, walk not after other gods, then will I cause you to dwell in this place in the land that I've given your fathers. Behold, you trust in lying words that cannot profit. Will you steal and murder and commit adultery and swear falsely and burn incense to Baal and walk after other gods and come and stand before me in this house which is called by my name and say, We're delivered to do all these abominations? Does this house which is called by my name become a den of robbers in your eyes? Verse 12, Go now unto my place which was in Shiloh, where I set my name at the first, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of the people of Israel. Because you've done all these works, says the Lord, and I speak unto you, rising up early and speaking, but you heard not. I called you, but you answered not. Therefore will I do unto this house which is called by my name, wherein you trust, and unto the place which I gave to you and to your fathers, as I have done to Shiloh. It goes on down. It talks about the idolatrous festivals. Verse 18 talks about making cakes to the Queen of Heaven. The original hot cross buns go back to, that's where it goes back to. Where do you think, where do you think the name Easter comes from? Ishtar, Astarte. The original hot cross buns go right back to the cakes that were made for the Queen of Heaven. God says, you think you can do this? Not provoke me to anger? No, God says, my anger is going to be poured out and it's not going to be quenched. Now, what did God tell them through Jeremiah? They put their trust and their confidence in the temple. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. God will take care of us because this is His temple. This is His headquarters. This is His ark. God will protect it. God will take care of it. We're safe. We're okay. We're fine. We're at the right place. We're here in Jerusalem, right next to the temple. Jeremiah said, any of you taken a hike up to Shiloh lately and seen what that looked like? You seen Shiloh? Shiloh was desolate. Shiloh, there was nothing there to see. Shiloh was scraped bald like the top of scrape ball like a field. There was nothing there. Now Shiloh is where God had placed His name and where God had set His headquarters for over 300 years. There were people that put their trust and their confidence in the presence of the ark, and they died. There were people in Jerusalem that placed their trust and their confidence in the presence of the temple and in the ark. They put their trust and their confidence in the ark and in the temple, and they died. And Jerusalem lay just as desolate as Shiloh. Brethren, they overlooked the fact that the source of security was not the ark. The source of security was not the temple. The source of security was the Lord God Almighty. You can't just live any old way. You can't go into paganism and pursue after and become just like the world around and yet cling on to some sort of a connection with holy things, or that which was holy in the sense that God at one time placed His presence there. The temple ceased to be holy when God removed His presence, and Nebuchadnezzar came in and burned the place to the ground and destroyed it. Destroyed it. God allowed that to happen. The people were placing their confidence in the wrong thing. Now, this lesson is made even clearer when we come to the New Testament. Even clearer when we come to the New Testament. Let's notice back in John chapter 4. Here's the story of Jesus at the well in Samaria and His encounter with the Samaritan woman. Now, of course, the Jews normally had no dealings with the Samaritans. You remember the story of the Samaritans. We could find it. I won't turn there for the sake of time, but back in 2 Kings chapter 17, you had the story of when northern Israel, the northern 10 tribes, were taken into captivity by the Assyrians, settled up in the river, up in the cities of the Medes, up off the river Gozan, up in the area between the Black and the Caspian Sea. Northern Israel was taken into captivity, and Gentile people from the area of Babylon were brought in and settled in the land of northern Israel. And they constructed sort of an amalgam of Babylonian paganism, Israelite paganism, with a little bit of overlay of the truth. In other words, they used the name of the true God of Israel, but they mixed in the Israelite paganism that the Jeroboam had concocted with the golden calves and all of this. Then they mixed in the worship of the false gods of Babylon. But interestingly enough, the things that continued there in northern Israel, the Samaritans picked up many of the symbols of northern Israel. One of the things, interestingly enough, we come on down into the New Testament period, the Samaritans were practicing circumcision. They practiced circumcision. They had the symbol that identified them as God's people, as the children of Abraham. Were they? No. Neither physically nor spiritually were they the children of Abraham. They weren't really worshiping the God of Abraham, but they used certain names, they used certain traditions and certain ceremonies. Idolatry represents the elevation of symbolism over substance. A focus on a symbol. In fact, maybe more accurately, we should say the displacement of substance with symbol. There's nothing inherently wrong with symbolism if it is biblical and godly, if it is appropriate. We eat unleavened bread during the days of unleavened bread. That's symbolic. It reminds us of certain things, and we go over that during the days of unleavened bread. Baptism itself involves symbolism. Just simply going into water does not bestow any spiritual effect. I mean, you can take a bath, you can go swimming, you can dive into the deep end of the swimming pool, you can be held underwater, you can do all sorts of things, and none of those things convey any spiritual benefit. It is not simply immersion in water, it is the fact of when it is accompanied by a spiritual change on the inside. There's nothing inherently wrong with symbols if those symbols are godly symbols and not pagan symbols, as long as it's recognized for what they are. And the tendency of human beings is to substitute symbols for substance. This was, of course, the case. We saw that happened with Israel at Shiloh and in Jerusalem. Now, the Samaritans had maintained their amalgam of religion down for a period of time, and it was a mixture. Christ was here talking to the woman at the well in Samaria, and she was surprised that a Jew would even talk with her. Now, there is an interesting statement when Christ had told her in verse 16 to call her husband, and she said, "Well, I don't have a husband." And he said, "That's right. I'm glad you got that one right when you said you don't have a husband, because you've had 5 of them, and the one you're living with now is not your husband." "Oh, well," she said, "I perceive you're a prophet." She began to get a little bit nervous about that time. Then she had a Bible question for him. She said, "Our fathers worshipped in this mountain. You say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship." Now she had a question. She says, "What I want to know is, where is God? Our fathers believe right here in this mountain," which was Mount Gerizim. Now, if you remember the story of the time of Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah, at the end of the book of Nehemiah, you remember what Nehemiah did? He chased out the grandson of the high priest. The grandson of the high priest was married to the leader of the Samaritans. And Nehemiah expelled him from Jerusalem. Well, the grandson, whose name was Manasseh, went to Samaria, and his father-in-law built a temple there on Mount Gerizim. And Manasseh, who was the grandson of the high priest of Judah, was now ensconced as the high priest of the Samaritans, and the Samaritan high priesthood traced itself down from Manasseh. They claimed to be the legitimate heirs, because after all, weren't they in direct descent from Aaron? And he was the one who was in line. He was the oldest, and Nehemiah kicked him out. So he claimed that he was the legitimate high priest, and the Samaritans constructed a temple on Mount Gerizim, and that was the center of Samaritan worship. Well, the Samaritan woman said, "Our fathers worship in this mountain, in Mount Gerizim, here near Samaria." And Mount Gerizim, you can go back and read the story. You know, Mount Gerizim had a history when Joshua, back at the time when Israel was going to cross the Jordan River, and you read the exploits, you just look up Mount Gerizim, and it's mentioned earlier back in Deuteronomy and Joshua. So she said, "We have always believed this is the place. This is where we worship. But you Jews say that Jerusalem is the only place." And Jesus said unto her, "Woman, believe me, the hour comes when you shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father." You see, in a matter of a few years, the Romans were going to come in and destroy both places. And there wouldn't be anything left. There wouldn't be a Jerusalem. There wouldn't be a temple in Jerusalem. There wouldn't be a temple in Mount Gerizim. There wouldn't be any of it. So Christ said, look, the time is quickly coming when you're not going to worship in Mount Gerizim, and the Jews aren't going to worship in Jerusalem. Then he went on to tell her, verse 22, "You worship you know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews." So he makes the clear point that Mount Gerizim and the priesthood and the things that had been preserved there did not represent a continuation of the truth of God, that what had been preserved by the Jews in Jerusalem represented a continuation of God's truth. But He went on to say, verse 23, "The hour comes and now is when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeks such to worship Him." God is a spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. You see, this woman, like so many others, thought that worship was tied to a geographical location. She thought it was simply a matter of being in the right place. You could worship God if you were in Mount Gerizim, or if you were in Jerusalem, or at an earlier time, Shiloh. She thought that the worship of God depended on where you were, and that a connection with God had to do with a connection to a physical location. Jesus Christ made the statement. He said, "Look, the time is coming when you're not going to worship in Mount Gerizim. Jews aren't going to worship in Jerusalem. The true worshipers will have to worship the Father in spirit and in truth." Now, here, with this statement, we come to what represents one of the significant changes from the administration of the Old Testament to the New Testament. Symbolism played a far bigger role in the Old Testament than it does in the New. And geography and a sense of place, in terms of a physical location, played a far bigger role in the Old Testament than in the New. Let me explain. God was in the Old Testament dealing primarily with a physical nation. He was dealing with the children of Israel. He was dealing with people who did not have His Spirit, people that were a physical nation. And they went through certain things as a nation. Now, in the New Testament, God is dealing with a people called out of many nations. We represent a wide range of ethnic groups. We're not simply in one place geographically, and we don't all have one origin in terms of the different nations or families of mankind. The true worship, Jesus says, is worship of the Father in spirit and in truth, and it's not dependent on a geographical location. That was going to be enforced because, you see, Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. Then where was the worship of God to be done? You can see to this day and realize that the Jews have never fully gotten the point. I don't know how many of you remember. I do very clearly, and I'm sure a number of you may as well. Remember the news clips back in 1967 at the Six-Day War when Jerusalem was reclaimed. And this war that took place in a very remarkable way, the so-called Six-Day War, came through, and when the Jews came in, when the armies came into Jerusalem, and they came there to what's called the Wailing Wall, which was the remains of a retaining wall, a part of the outer courtyard of the temple. The only thing that has physical connection reaching back 2,000 years ago. And how these soldiers came up there and ran up there to this wall and began to pray, and you saw the tremendous outpouring of emotion and the intensity of emotion. And anyone who saw that at that time knows that they will never, ever willingly give up Jerusalem. The point is, though, to them, Jerusalem is the place to worship. This geographic location, this connection with place, with geography. Jesus said, look, the true worshipers are those who worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Hebrews 13:14 makes an important statement. Paul is writing it to people of a Hebrew background, people who have had the idea that Jerusalem is the place to worship. And in Hebrews 13:14, he says, "For here we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come." We have no continuing city. The history of the people of God in the New Testament has not been the history of a continuing place. It has not been the story of Jerusalem and the ark. You see, God already allowed the record to be made clear in the Old Testament that even then, God could not be reduced down to being a good luck charm. That you sort of brought Him out and used Him when you needed Him and ignored Him the rest of the time. Ultimately, the true worshipers must worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And this is made even more evident in the New Testament because the history of the New Testament church has been of a scattered, persecuted group of people whose history over the centuries is a people on the move. From Judea to Asia Minor to up in the mountains of Armenia. Of the way places down through the centuries. The true worshipers must worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Paul says, we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come. Now we seek a city that will come and will continue forever, and that city is the New Jerusalem, which will come down from God out of heaven. We don't have here on this earth Jerusalem or Rome or some physical location that is the essence of what constitutes true worship. The true worshipers must worship the Father in spirit and in truth, because in reality, you see, the true worshipers, those who truly had a spiritual connection with God, have always worshiped Him in spirit and in truth. There was a lot more symbolism and physical continuity in the Old Testament. You know, the Old Testament church was symbolized by one candlestick that had 7 branches. The New Testament church is symbolized by 7 different candlesticks. Read it there in Revelation 1. There is a difference. There is not the same level of physical continuity. The Old Testament church, the congregation of Israel, the church in the wilderness, was in one geographic location. They were one people in one basic location with one center there that was located, and there was a physical continuity for century after century. There's never been that in the history of the New Testament church. The Catholics, of course, have elevated symbolism and totally displaced any substance with it. And they have sought to maintain that facade of a continuing city and a continuity, and you can always look back to Rome. But I think we all know that that does not represent the continuation of what God is doing and where God is worshipped in spirit and in truth. We have no continuing city, but we seek one to come. Back in Galatians chapter 4, Paul addresses this in a little different way. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 22. Now, Paul is dealing with those who put their trust and their confidence in obedience to the ceremonial law. Those who put their trust and their confidence in the ceremony and the ritual, and who thought that somehow access to God and a relationship with God was dependent and was tied in with simply the carrying out of physical ceremony. And they did not get the point. And so Paul begins to explain to them a little bit of the difference between the Old and the New Covenant. And in Galatians chapter 4, verse 22, he says, "It is written that Abraham had 2 sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. He who was of the bondmaid was born after the flesh." It was purely a natural physical event. Nothing miraculous about it. It just represented the ordinary course of nature. He that was of the free woman was by promise. That was a miracle, which things are an allegory. They are representative. They are illustrative of a spiritual point. They literally happened, but there is a point from which there's a point that we can learn from this event. This is representative of the two covenants. The one from Mount Sinai, which leads to bondage, which is Hagar. This Hagar is Mount Sinai and Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. Now there's a contrast here between the Old and the New. He said, now look, the Old Covenant, which had its origin there on Mount Sinai, is analogous to Jerusalem, which now is. That's the headquarters. You know, a city was looked upon anciently. The Greeks used the metaphor feminine metaphor to refer to a city, and the citizenship had to do with you were the children of a certain city. And citizenship derived from the city of birth, the city of nativity. That's where our word native comes from. He's a native. He is a native of this place or that place. Well, this season of the year we hear about nativity scenes. That's just a word that means birth. A native means someone who was born there. The citizens of Athens was viewed as their mother. It was the mother city. And so the illusion of a city being the mother of its inhabitants was a common figure of speech. Citizenship derived from from your city of origin. So here he is drawing a contrast between those who are the adherents of the Old Covenant, those who are the citizens of Jerusalem that now is. And he said, Jerusalem that now is in bondage with her children. Jerusalem was in physical bondage. It was a captive city of the Romans, ruled over by a Roman government. It was not free physically, and it wasn't free spiritually. The people who were the citizens of Jerusalem were neither free physically nor spiritually. They were in bondage physically to the Romans, and spiritually they were in bondage to sin. They were in bondage to sin. The Old Covenant did not contain what was necessary to break the bonds of sin. The performance of physical rituals carried out when someone had broken the Ten Commandments did not atone for sin. And the bondage of sin held men in its sway, and the ultimate captivity, which is death, was the outcome. And that was the prison from whence no one had ever been able to escape. Houdini was the great escape artist. And he prided himself on being able to escape from everywhere and anywhere. And, any of you have ever read about him, some of his feats were amazing. Another thing about Houdini, he was a debunker of people who claimed to be in contact with the spirit realm and things of this sort. He was a master trickster, and he understood illusion, and he was a man who was searching. He didn't understand what the truth was, but he could see where it wasn't. And time after time, he debunked as frauds many of these people that had sort of fooled everyone else. Houdini did not know what lay beyond death. But he told his wife, as he himself lay near death, he said, I have escaped from everything. I've never been imprisoned in anything that I couldn't get out of. And he had done incredible things. He'd had, law enforcement officers lock him in a jail cell, strip him of all of his clothes, lock him in a jail cell, and in a short amount of time he was out of jail and found some clothes and was dressed, out there waiting for them. And just incredible things, had himself, bound up in a straitjacket with chains, dumped from a boat. It was incredible, the things that he was able to do, and a lot of his tricks no one ever fully figured out. Some have been duplicated. But he told his wife, he said, I'm an escape artist, and he said, if there's any way to get out of anywhere, I'll find it. He said, I don't know what lies beyond death, but if it's possible to escape, I will. And he gave her a code word. And he said, you know, there will probably be a lot of people who will claim, a lot of mediums and people that claim they're in contact with the spirit world, who will claim that they have contacted me. And he said, if they can't give you this code word, you will know that they're a fraud. Well, needless to say, Houdini never made his final escape. He's in the grave. And he can't escape from that. The only way that he will ever come out of that grave is in the resurrection. No human being has ever been able to make the escape from death. But Jesus Christ triumphed over death. And through the power of the Father was raised from the dead. And it's through Him that all can escape from that ultimate bondage. So he said the Jerusalem that now is in bondage with her children. All of those who are a part of that system and whose hope and confidence is in the Old Covenant are still in bondage. Because, brethren, if the Old Covenant had been sufficient, there would never have been a reason for a new covenant. There was a problem with the Old Covenant. Those who were the adherents of the Old Covenant were just like their mother city. They were in bondage. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. Our mother city is the New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem that is going to come down from God out of heaven. The New Jerusalem. That's where we have our citizenship. Our citizenship is now in heaven. We're not in heaven, but our citizenship is there. We're citizens of the New Jerusalem and are therefore ambassadors, emissaries of the kingdom of God, ambassadors for Christ. Jerusalem, which is above, is free. The New Jerusalem is not in bondage, and the children of the New Jerusalem are not in bondage. Let's go on. Let's understand how this ties in with worship in spirit and in truth. Isaiah 29. Isaiah 29 and verse 13. Wherefore the Lord says, for as much as this people draw near unto me with their mouth and with their lips do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precepts of men. Now notice, he talks about a people that draw near in physical proximity. They draw near with their mouth and with their lips. They say the right things. They draw near to a physical location. But their heart is far from me. Their heart is far from me. On back in Ezekiel 33. Ezekiel 33 and verse 31. They come unto you as the people comes, and they sit before me as my people. They hear your words, but they will not do them. For with their mouth they show much love, but their heart goes after their covetousness. So here's the dichotomy. Here are people who represent themselves to be one thing, but with their heart they are something else. With their heart they are not what they claim to be. Let's come on forward to Matthew 15. Matthew 15:1. Then came Jesus scribes and Pharisees which were in Jerusalem, saying, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat. And he said, why do you also transgress the commandments of God by your tradition? God commanded, saying, honor your father and your mother, and he that curses father and mother shall die the death. And you say, whosoever shall say to his father and mother, it's a gift, by whatsoever you might be profited by me, and honor not his father or his mother, he shall be free. You've made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. They set aside certain property and they labeled it Corban or holy. They said, this is dedicated to God. Now, it wasn't something they had to give to God in their lifetime. It was something, in effect, they deeded it to God afterward, and therefore they had residual use. They had a whole string of laws and regulations strung up for this, but the effect of it was that any relative, particularly elderly parents, who may have needed help, they could say, oh, well, hey, I wish I could help you. Wish I had it here to help you, but, hey, this is dedicated to God. This is dedicated to God. This is holy. Well, they had come up with a tradition. They had come up with a custom that circumvented the intent of God's law. He said, you hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people draws near unto me with their mouth and honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. He called the multitudes, and he said, hear and understand, not that which goes into a man, into the mouth defiles a man, but that which comes out of the mouth, this defiles the man. The disciples came and said, I think the Pharisees were offended. Verse 12, and he said, well, every plant that my Father has not planted is going to be rooted up. Let them alone. They're blind leaders of the blind. If the blind lead the blind, they'll both fall in the ditch. Peter wanted to understand the parable, and he said, look, verse 17, don't you realize whatever goes in at the mouth enters into the belly and is cast out into the draught? You put it in, and it goes through your digestive system, and it comes out. Those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile the man. Because you see, we're told back in Matthew 12 that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And that is, that's back in Matthew 12:34. So he says, look, what comes out of the mouth comes from the heart. It's out of the heart, out of the abundance of the heart, out of what you really are on the inside that these things come out. And they defile the man. Out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands doesn't defile a man. They had made a great issue of ceremonial washing. If they came in from the market, they had this great ceremony of washing because they may have come in contact with a sinner. And they needed to wash away all the defilement that came in that they may have contacted. They may have brushed against somebody that was a sinner, somebody that had been defiled. And they had had all of this concoction of ritual that they had put together that set them apart, that they were holy and everybody else was unclean. And Christ's disciples were not following all this rigmarole. Now, this was not based on the law of God. This was based on the traditions of men. But in their eyes and in their mind, that was religion. That constituted religion. And Christ said, that's not what religion is all about. Religion is not simply a manner of external ceremonial things. It has to do with what is on the inside. Now, what's on the inside will come out. It'll come out in your words and in your actions. If we are what we're supposed to be on the inside, it will reflect itself in the way we talk. It will reflect itself in the things we do. You can do the things you ought on the outside without doing it on the in. But you can't be what you ought to be on the inside and not have it reflected out the outside. What does it mean to worship God in spirit and in truth? Jesus Christ was telling the woman at the well and emphasizing that the time was quickly coming. There was a transition coming. And under the new covenant, simply the carrying out of ceremony, the physical connection and proximity to some place, was not what was going to do it. Now, it never had been the real essence of spiritual worship. That's where the Israelites in Shiloh had gotten into their mistake with the ark. They thought that a connection with a physical object was the same thing as having God among them. But they had departed from God in their hearts and in their minds. And as a result, God's help was nowhere to be found. Notice back in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, because I want us to put some of this together and even understand that there is a transition from the old to the new in terms of the people of God. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. Paul talks about that we have been made able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills and the Spirit gives life. If the administration of death, written and engraven in stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not look steadfastly on his face, could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses, for the glory of his countenance, which glory was done away, how shall not the ministers of the Spirit, the ministration of the Spirit, be rather glorious? Now, you remember the story. We have the account given way back in Exodus of when Moses went up in the mountain to receive the 2 tables of stone, the 10 Commandments, the law of God, written with the finger of God in tables of stone. Moses being there in the presence of God, coming down the mountain, his face glowed. And it glowed so brightly the people were frightened. And Moses had to put a veil over his face. And a period of weeks went by, days and weeks, we're not told exactly how long, and it gradually faded. And Paul quotes that. You can read it back in Exodus. Paul quotes that, and he said, the administration of death. Because the old covenant was a covenant with a physical nation. It had to do with the application of the letter of the law. Physical penalties exacted upon a physical penalty, physical penalties on a physical people for transgression of the letter of the law. There were physical blessings if they obeyed. They were not promised eternal life. They were promised physical blessings and abundance in the land for obeying the letter of the law. Well, we know what happened. They failed. They never succeeded. They never lived up to their part. That's why we're told, you see, there was a fault with the old covenant for finding fault with them, God says in Hebrews 8, for finding fault with them. He says, this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my laws into their hearts and into their minds, and they will be to me a people, and I'll be to them a God. The people did not continue in God's covenant. They transgressed. They departed from the law. But what is Paul bringing out here? He's bringing out that the new covenant has to do with the administration of the Spirit of the law. If the old covenant, which had to do with the administration of the letter of the law, if that was glorious, but it was a glory that faded, how much more glorious is the administration of the Spirit of the law? Same law, the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments written with the finger of God on tables of stone form the basis of the Old Covenant. The 10 Commandments, the law of God written with the Spirit of God in the hearts and minds of surrendered human beings, is the essence of the New Covenant. God's law written in our hearts and in our minds. Not simply the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, the intent of the law. Coming on down in Romans chapter 2. Romans 2:29. He is not a Jew, he is a Jew which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. The true Jews, the spiritual Jews, are those who have an inward circumcision, circumcision of the heart, in the spirit and not in the letter. It's not simply our relationship with God. Our access to God does not derive from a physical ceremony. It does not derive from the letter of the law. It does not derive from the performance of a physical ceremony. Our access to God has to do with something spiritual. The spirit of the law. Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7. In verse 5. When we were in the flesh, the motions of sins which were by the law did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, we should serve in newness of spirit and not in oldness of the letter. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. No, I had not known sin but by the law. I had not known lust, except the law said, you shall not covet. Paul's not saying that the law is done away. Delivered from the law doesn't mean that the law is done away and you don't have to keep it. It means we are delivered from the penalty of the law. The law requires the death penalty. The way sin is the transgression of the law. The wages of sin is death. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We are now free to serve in newness of spirit. Not simply carrying out the letter of the law, but going on to the spirit and the intent of the law. You see, the Jews wanted to keep arguing about the letter of the law. Christ asked the lawyer, he said, when the question came up about what is the great commandment? Christ said, well, how do you understand it? He said, well, love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. And Christ said, that's right. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. And the man willing to justify himself said, but who is my neighbor? And the Jews got into great debate about who constituted your neighbor. They missed the point. Jesus told him the story of a man who was going down from Jericho to Jerusalem, and he told about various ones who came by. The man fell among thieves and was laying there ready to die. And a Samaritan finally was the one who came along and rendered him aid. A priest had come by, a Levite had come by. Finally the Samaritan did, and Jesus said, who was a neighbor unto him? Who was his neighbor? You see, the spirit of the law is the intent of the law. What is it that God is after? What is the intent and the purpose of the law? Paul explained it, for instance, in Ephesians. He said, now, let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands, that he may have to give to him that's in need. So he amplified the spirit of the law. He said it's not enough just to quit stealing. The law says don't steal. The letter of the law is don't steal. And there are all sorts of lawyers who spend their time trying to figure out how you can circumvent the spirit of the law and manage to finagle through some loophole. Christ said, and Paul said, look, the spirit of the law is not only quit stealing, but go out, get a job, be productive, be a giving, sharing person. Be productive so you can help others. It's not enough just to quit taking away from them what belongs to them, but be productive so you can give and share and help. The spirit of the law. We're to serve in newness of spirit. The spirit of the law does not spiritualize away the law. It carries beyond and goes into the intent and purpose of the law. It does not use a substitute. Simply going through the motions. Let's notice in Philippians 3:3. Philippians 3:3 says, we are the circumcision which worship God in the Spirit, and rejoice in Christ Jesus, and have no confidence in the flesh. He said, I don't put my confidence and my trust in the physical things. Our relationship with God is not dependent on physical things. Our ability to pray to God is not dependent on a geographical location. It's not dependent on the physical ritual of circumcision. Our relationship with God, our access to God, is not dependent on something physical. It is dependent upon something spiritual. We worship God in the Spirit. Jesus said the true worshipers must worship the Father in spirit and in truth. We've got to worship from the heart. Now, we also have to worship in truth. You can't worship the Father in spirit and in error. And you can't worship in truth and in the letter either. Just the letter of truth is not sufficient. And being wrong, if you have a good attitude, is not sufficient either. Not in terms of a true relationship with God. You know, there may be Buddhists that have a good attitude. But you have to worship the Father in spirit and in truth. So our relationship with God is based on His truth, which He reveals in His Word. God's Word is truth. But it goes far beyond simply knowing a list of doctrines. The true worship of the true God goes way beyond simply knowing that this is right and this is wrong, knowing the technical answer and explanation to certain scriptures. The true worship of the true God goes way beyond simply going through the motions. It goes way beyond the letter. The true worship of the true God proceeds from the heart. It is from mind and heart. Substance, not symbolism. Substance. Worship in truth, worship in God in the Spirit is worship. It has to do with substance. Simply, the letter of circumcision was a symbol. Circumcision symbolized something. But you see, over and over, the symbol became substituted for the reality. The reality was lost and the symbol was maintained and elevated to idolatrous heights. And that's what we have to deeply understand. That the true worship of the true God is something that must be carried out in spirit and in truth. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 44, for every tree is known by his own fruit. Of thorns men do not gather figs, nor a bramble bush gather they grapes. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth that which is good. And an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth that which is evil. For of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. Why call you me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? Whosoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, I'll show you to whom he is like. He's like a man which built a house, and he digged deep, and he laid the foundation on a rock. And when the flood arose and the stream beat vehemently upon that house and could not shake it, for it was founded upon the rock. But he that hears and does not is like a man that without foundation built his house upon the earth, against which the stream did beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. It's not enough to pay lip service. It's not enough to draw near to God with our mouth. It's not enough to be technically and doctrinally correct. We've got to be right from the inside out. We've got to serve God in spirit and in truth. A geographical connection won't save you. An organizational connection won't save you. Sitting in a seat here or somewhere else is not going to save you. Temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Jeremiah told them, go take a look at Shiloh. It was representative of a people that drew near with their mouth, but they were far with their heart. The true people of God The true worshipers must worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Brethren, we need to understand the times in which we're living. We need to understand that we're not here just to play church. It's not a game, it's not a contest. It has to do with a relationship with the true God, the Creator, the living God. God the Father and His Son Jesus Christ sitting at His right hand, who's going to return to this earth as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It is a relationship with the true God that will have a transforming effect in our lives, in our hearts, in our minds, in our actions. It will reflect itself in the way that we deal with one another, in the way that we deal with everyone with whom we come in contact. We're never going to be at peace with God and at peace, or we're never going to be at peace with anyone unless first we're at peace with God. We're not going to be at peace in our home and with our neighbor unless there is a peace with God. It comes from walking with God and putting our lives in His hands and worshiping the Father in spirit and in truth. Not simply going through letter of the law observance and thinking that somehow that's enough, but worshiping God from the heart. Putting our hearts into it. Ultimately, brethren, the work of God is going to be completed successfully. In Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 32, we're told that those who know their God shall be strong and do exploits. They'll be strong and do the work. But the first step is those who know their God. The true worshipers must worship the Father in spirit and in truth. In the Old Testament, there was more of an outward symbolism. Much of that has been removed in the New. There's not been a continuing city except the New Jerusalem. That's where our citizenship is. We don't take our citizenship, our loyalty, and our allegiance simply to the temporary, the physical, the transitory, but to what is real and abiding and eternal. Our loyalty, our allegiance, and our devotion must be to God and to His way. It must come out of us in all of our dealings and all of our ways. It has to do with a transformation from the inside out. A change and transforming of our hearts and our minds and our innermost being. That we can walk with God and serve God, love one another, and go forward with our hearts in the completion of the great work that God has set before us to do.